What's going on, y'all? I wanted to put this video together because I just tuned this car, at least briefly, with no idle air controller. My car doesn't have a idle air control valve, and I thought that it might be helpful for those out there without an idle air controller to see a little bit about, I guess, how to do it. I'm not an expert, so please take my thoughts with a grain of salt. Feel free to comment about my technique and what I'm doing wrong, what my thought process is wrong and incorrect. I love learning, so definitely tell me what I'm doing wrong. I would love to hear critique. So just to tell you a little bit about this car, it's a turbo E30 with a M30 motor from a 5 Series. It's a 3.5 Big 6 with BorgWarner S256 turbo. The guy's had it tuned. He just picked it up. The guy he bought it from had it tuned from some unknown tuner, and he does drag cars apparently, and the car moves apparently. So let me just show you a video from when he picked it up. And obviously enough power to be useless in rain, as we all know. The car is pretty standard, as you might imagine, besides the turbo. I can't do two things at once here, looking for photos and also talking to y'all. Valve train refresh. It had race springs installed, I think stock cam, but head studs and factory head gasket and a crank scraper. So not too much done to it. I just saw that, and it looks like it's bent a rod before. No? Am I going crazy? I hope those aren't edges on the balance, counterbalance. Oh, that's sketchy. Okay. With that said, let's move on. Talk about idle air. So he sent me this log to just take a look at the tune and if there's anything that could be improved that was obvious, I suppose. So when you're getting a tune that is on a car that you've only driven a little bit and don't really know a lot about the history, it's always a mystery in terms of how well the car has been tuned and what it was tuned for. As I said, the guy was apparently a drag car tuner, and not a lot of the areas for the map under cruise have been ironed out, so it's apparently made to go in a straight line really quickly. I guess it doesn't matter if it's straight or not. The motor has nothing to do with that portion of racing. So anyway, I digress. The RPM here, you can just see it's hunting all over the place, right? It's going from 1030 to 14. So it's swinging 400 RPM over and over and over and over again. Look at this, how rhythmic it is. And if you don't know, this is sort of a classic vacuum leak symptom, right? Because idle hunt, what happens is the motor expects a certain amount of air. It gets a little bit more air. Idle speeds up a little bit because the cylinders consume the air. Once the idle speed is up, it doesn't have enough air to sustain that, and then the manifold pressure falls. As manifold pressure falls, doesn't have enough fuel, or has too much fuel to speed up the motor again, and then this sort of circle happens. And if you look here in the log relevant to this, the map relevant to this log, you'll see that it does exactly that. Forwards and backwards doesn't really matter, but it's going to get fuel, get air, speed up. As it gets air, loses pressure in the intake manifold, loses fuel, continues, so on and so forth, and you get this hunt. So I guess it is obvious for those who have experienced it, but that's sort of the visual representation. And if we look here, let's just sort of break this down a little bit. Now, just going down here to this bottom segment of the log, the VE table going over and under what the motor really wants. Obviously, the motor's trying to average right in the center, but if it doesn't have the correct value for fuel at the exact moment, you sort of swing past it, and then it gets worse and worse and worse. So when this happens, you also see spark advance going up and down as well, and we'll get to that in just a second. You probably want to average this to a certain value, and the average of this, maybe I should go peak to peak just to clarify the point, or peak to valley, I guess is the correct way to do it, right? VE is average 61.5, 63 max, and 60. So as I said, and as I'm sure you've seen demonstrated, it's getting fuel, getting less fuel, getting fuel, getting less fuel over and over and over again. And likewise, it's also getting spark. So as you know, more spark, more power, up to a point, obviously, but more spark, more power, more speed, more idle speed, and that's just going to make the issue worse. So you get more fuel, more air, more spark, and obviously the motor's going to want to speed up or come down depending on what side of the cycle it's on. And we look at manifold pressure as well. It's going from 49 to 42 roughly, and just does that over and over and over again. Now, something to consider, the peaks and valleys of this right here may be in an area of the map where it's going to continue cycling. If you have a lot of resolution in this table, let me just do this so it doesn't bug out. If you have a lot of resolution in this table, you may even spread across 3 rows, you may spread across 3 columns, maybe 3 rows, 3 columns. It just depends on what your map is like in the idle areas, and what your bins are set at. So I won't spend too much time on this whole VE table, because that's, I think, another topic. The map sensor only goes down to 20, and it only goes up to 250, and it's only running 11 pounds of boost. So right here at 180, I'm gonna whatever. I try and give people the benefit of the doubt. I don't know what happens with some of these things. So perhaps the car was rebuilt and had a different setup. Who knows? I don't want to say that there's a good or bad reason for it. So anyway, let me get back on topic here. Since we know that idle air controller, the car doesn't have an idle air controller, it's going to get a fixed amount of air and just continue, or rather, not necessarily a fixed amount of air, but a fixed opening. So if the motor is at a good equilibrium with the amount of air that it's or opening that it's going to get, that it's going to be stable. Just in a simplification, right? So if air is equal, or excuse me, at equilibrium, fuel is at equilibrium, spark is at equilibrium, RPM should be at equilibrium, right? Same fuel, same air, same spark. And what that means is it's same power all the time. Now, the easiest way to rectify this, obviously, is if you don't know how a map works, it's going to be taking a value from 4 different points on the map, and let's say that it's on this top left corner of the 60. It's going to also weight the 62, the 67, and the 58, and that's actually what's happening here. And it shows 40% from the 60, 16% from the 67, 12% from 62, and the remaining from 58. So what's happening is the VE is never solid as it moves around the map. So unless it's smack dab right in the middle of one cell, I'm not even sure that this actually happens, but theoretically, if it's smack dab right in the middle of one cell, it's only going to use that value. But as soon as it starts moving over, let's say that RPM starts creeping up just by happenstance, right? We got a lot of things happening at idle. Got valves opening and closing, got, injectors pulsing. Maybe the injector pulse isn't perfect on every cylinder. These are all things that you got to consider. So One cylinder may have better compression than another, might speed up and slow down depending on what cylinder. So there's a lot of things happening at idle that you're not going to be able to totally account for. With that said, if RPM starts raising a little bit and we start bumping into this section of the map, it's going to add more fuel. And if it adds more fuel and it has the air to burn that fuel, RPM is going to continue raising until it gets to a point where it's consuming more air than the opening in the motor can supply, that is the throttle body. Map sensor will lower because you get less pressure in the intake manifold, also less fuel in this area of the map, and with that, the idle speed comes down more. When idle speed comes down more, there's less pressure and same amount of fuel or more fuel, and then this cycle continues. So it's just so cyclical, and it's obvious because if you have more fuel, you're going to want more air, or excuse me, if you have more air, you're going to want more fuel. If you have less air, you're going to need less fuel. And I hope that it's a little apparent in terms of what's actually happening here. So the quickest thing to do is just take these 4 cells and make them equal. So that's the first thing that I did. And spark advance, obviously another factor here, as I said. More spark advance, more power, more speed. So that's also a contributing factor. And you see spark advance also coming up and down. Maybe it's not such a big deal, 2 degrees, who knows? You can decide if that's actually a factor, and maybe it moves the idle around in small enough increments that you can be a little bit more precise with how you want your map to be. I know you only have 12 by 12 in this particular standalone for Megasquirt 2. So anyway, let me just show you what the changes were. This is the new map, and the only thing that has changed is I changed the idle spark area to a fixed 25%, or excuse me, 25 degrees. And it doesn't matter where in these 4 cells that it's going to be idling, it's going to get 25 degrees. And same thing for fuel. And you may ask yourself, well, how did you get these numbers? Why did you decide that it was these 4 cells? Well, one way you can do it is look at a log, or you can, obviously, you can do it when you're looking at the car. But if you're looking at a log, just consider the peak of the map sensor, the valley of the map sensor, the peak of RPM, and the valley of RPM. So we know that it doesn't go, approximately less than 1,000. Obviously this is not perfect, but let's just, for argument's sake, say that this is 1,000 and no more than 1,500, right? And we're right on the edge, but let's just also say that it's 50 and no less than 40. And actually we have these cells that are perfectly aligned to that, right? So 1,000, 50, 1,000, 40, 1,500, 40, 1,500, 50. And idle should never go outside this, at least with the amount of air that's being supplied to the motor. Forgive me, I'm getting over a cold. So obviously this is the biggest thing, and let me just open up a log of the new idle. So just looking at this log before I get to the map, looking at this log, it looks even worse than before, right? Well, the scale is different. So now if we look at, an average of the RPM, for example, it's 1130. Min is 1085. Max 1200. So it's swinging still, but not as hard and not as far. So obviously if you look at VE down here, it's a fixed 61, just as we saw from the map before, fixed 61, and timing same thing, fixed 25, and that smoothed it out quite a bit. So if you look at how it actually plays in the map, it just sits there, and it idles pretty smooth. Just like we talked about, there's a few things happening with valves opening and closing, and who knows what's really happening between these cylinders and moving RPM speed up and down, and the trigger wheel getting the speed to Megasquirt. So there's a lot of different things that you may or may not be able to factor in, and if you really wanted to, you could use 3 rows, 2 columns, or just break this up depending on where your idle is. The idle air controller for this particular car the throttle body is set up to have perfect cold start, and you don't have to touch the throttle when it's cold, but what that translates to is fast idle when it's warm. So in this case, probably needs to move the throttle stop back a little bit so that the idle is a little bit more streetable for driving around town. 1100, 1200 is not so bad, but it's higher than probably most people would want in the street, and probably contributing to a little extra heat, a little extra fuel consumption. So if you're trying to minimize these things on the street and you want something that's a little bit more manageable, and you have the wherewithal to give a little tap on the gas as you move away from a stoplight, then there's no reason to have your idle set super high. Just don't do it, in my opinion. Unless you have a crazy cam. But if you have a crazy cam, you're probably not watching this anyway. So I hope that was helpful. I'm not an expert, as I said, and I hope that you have some critique for me. I am always looking to learn, and it's helpful if you have something to say about it. So thank you so much. Drop me a like if you enjoyed it, and comment if you have critiques or you have different thoughts. I'm sure that we have different ways of tuning and have a smorgasbord of information out there. So I appreciate it.